Katrina Innovations podcast for Monday, October 3rd, 2005, show number 30, brought to you from Palo Alto, California via New Orleans. Hello, and welcome to the Katrina Innovations podcast. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. Before we get started, please keep in mind that the opinions and information expressed in this podcast are mine and mine alone and do not necessarily reflect those of my past, current, or future employers. Well, I'm just back. I actually flew in late last night from New Orleans. I'll talk more about New Orleans in the segment one of today's show. Thanks for the feedback. Got a lot of emails while I was offline in New Orleans, so it's going to take me a little while to catch up and reply, but be confident I will get back to each and every email that is sent in. If you'd like to send me an email, please send it to podcast@killerinnovations.com, or you can always leave me a voicemail message on 703-636-4460. If you leave me a message, I'll play it at the end of the upcoming podcast. This week, there were no messages left, so I'm feeling lonely. So if you have questions, comments, feedback, feel free to call the feedback line, and I'll play it again on an upcoming podcast. Or as always, you can also Skype me at Phil_McKinney. This week, I was offline while I was in New Orleans. I finally was able to log in Sunday morning before I flew back and saw an absolutely astronomical jump in the number of subscribers now listening to the podcast. Well, a little further investigation, I figured out why. On the front page of the Apple iTunes podcast page, the Killer Innovations podcast was highlighted under the category of business. So a number of new listeners, thank you for joining in. Now we're up to 30 shows, which means there's roughly 15 hours of back material on Killer Innovations that you can now have the enjoyment of trying to get caught up on. Today's show is going to be shorter than normal. For those of you who are regular listeners know that there's typically 3 segments. Segment 1 really talking about processes, tools, and tricks of innovation. Segment 2 typically looks at emerging trends or weak signals, early things that are underway that could potentially give you a hint to an upcoming innovation. And then segment 3, we talk about the killer question of the week. Given everything that's gone on this last week in New Orleans, this show is only going to have both segment 1 and segment 3. We're going to skip segment 2 today, so the show is going to be a little shorter than normal, and hopefully you'll bear with me on that. So, segment 1, what I'm going to talk about really is what I call Katrina Innovations. I flew down to New Orleans was it Monday, I guess it was. Actually, I couldn't even fly to New Orleans. I had to fly to Mobile, Alabama, and then drive 3.5 hours to New Orleans. The New Orleans airport at that point last Monday was not open for any commercial flight traffic. It was still only open for military flights as a result of Hurricane Katrina. And even at that time of night, you could clearly see the total destruction, the total devastation of New Orleans. No matter what you've seen on TV, what you've read in the newspaper, being on the ground in New Orleans, just the total destruction is orders of magnitude worse than anything that could be portrayed. It's the one situation where the news is actually underselling the total destruction. My role in New Orleans, I was asked to put together a team and go in and help bring back up critical communications infrastructure in New Orleans. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we actually did here later on in the show. But focus was primarily in being able to enable some kind of a communications infrastructure in and out of New Orleans. And so that was really, what my role there was. One of the things, though, when I arrived in New Orleans, that I thought, was kind of, I wouldn't say unique, but it was something that I picked up on that I had not noticed in other situations. I was, given my extensive travel, I have this nasty habit of being in countries or areas that are incredibly dangerous. I was in Caracas, Venezuela once when a coup attempt happened and had to be evacuated out. I was traveling in and out of Israel quite often during the heaviest times when there were all the terrorist bombings going on. I was in and out of Russia right around the time when the wall fell and the Russian states were all separating. So I have this kind of nasty habit of having bad timing, I guess, as my wife would say. But one of the things that I saw in Katrina, or with as a result of the Katrina hurricane in New Orleans, is what I would call kind of the MacGyver effect. You're looking at people who literally have lost everything of any kind of possession: homes, cars, boats, papers, photographs. Everything is just totally gone. But during those times when you're faced with that total destruction, or you're in the process of trying to survive the wrath of the hurricane, it really brings out people's ability to respond, to react, to have that level of creativity to solve the problem that they're facing right at that instant. Something that I call the MacGyver effect. Now, for those of you who either aren't old enough to remember the TV show MacGyver, or maybe MacGyver is a show that you've never seen if you're outside the U.S. or not in a country where they have playbacks or reruns. MacGyver was a show that played, I guess it was in the 1980s here in the U.S. And basically it was about this character, this guy who, you could basically give him one stick of chewing gum, 10 feet of twine, and a couple of popsicle sticks, and he could build an entire airplane that could fly 50 people out. And at the end of the show, he always saves the day and was always able to use whatever was around him to solve whatever problem he had. And it was always involved a Swiss Army knife. But when you look at, people facing, danger or survival, I think the MacGyver effect, which is really a kind of a deep down ability to respond and to be creative and to innovate on the fly in order to solve the pressing problem, is something that everybody has. And let me tell you, it was in full bloom in New Orleans while I was there. And one of the things I was trying to think about, what is it that really enables this MacGyver effect from the standpoint of being able to respond to danger or this sense of urgency? Well, one is that urgency really brings focus, whether that's floodwaters coming in or your boss saying, we got to hit this deadline, or we need ideas in order to solve this problem, or we're going to lose a customer, or whatever the case might be. Urgency brings focus. Now, focus also, what I would say is focus also brings clarity. You can't be distracted by the fringe areas. You've got to be focused on exactly what the problem is, or what the impending danger is that's looming in front of you. So urgency brings focus brings clarity, and next I would say that clarity brings proper prioritization. I think for those people who can respond, who can step in and take leadership roles when there's this sense of urgency, such as Hurricane Katrina or the terrorist bombings, whether that be in Madrid, London, or in New York City, clarity brings proper prioritization. And you can look at all of the results of whether, how the political leaders responded to Hurricane Katrina versus how did political leaders respond to 9/11 bombings, or the bombings of Madrid, the bombings of London, or in other cities around the world, most recently Bali, is that proper prioritization. The event is happening, or the event has just happened. You need to solve the problem. You're digging deep inside of yourself to come up with solutions or innovations or ideas to address the problem. How do you do proper prioritization? How do you know that you're doing the right things in the right order as a result of the challenge that you're facing? So again, this MacGyver effect is really driven by the fact of this sense of urgency, whether it be danger, physical danger, or success, risks. Urgency brings focus. Focus brings clarity. And then clarity brings proper prioritization. So, what were some of the Katrina innovations that I observed while I was in New Orleans? Some of them are fairly mundane, but clearly a unique way to look at solving the problem. One is the issue of gas. Quickly after Katrina hit, the police departments in New Orleans ran out of gas in the police cars to get around. And none of the gas stations were open. Gas was literally not available anywhere in the New Orleans area. And what one of the leaders in the police department quickly recalled is that there were a lot of car dealerships with cars still sitting on the lots. So they sent the police department to literally siphon gas out of all the gas tanks of all the cars sitting on the police lots in order to have that gasoline available for the police cruisers in order to respond to emergencies. The other is that the emergency workers, rescue workers, when they showed up in New Orleans, found out that none of the communications infrastructure was up and operational, either from damage to equipment such as towers, or by the fact of loss of electricity, or out of service because of severe flooding. And what the emergency workers quickly did was procure literally any of the, cheap, what we call family radio services or FRS radios here in the U.S. from Radio Shack. And literally the emergency responders were using Radio Shack walkie-talkies in order to create, in effect, an ad hoc communications network that enabled them to perform the rescues that were so desperately needed. One innovation, albeit it did not come up in Katrina, but one that people in New Orleans and even I had to experience this, was the innovation that went into creating MREs, or meals ready to eat. These come in the brown plastic pouches. You can open them up, and these are literally meals that the military use. Interestingly enough, these meals are quite innovative. Literally, you can have a little heater pouch. You take whatever it is, whether it's casserole or soup or whatever it is, slide it into the pouch, put in about 3 ounces of water. The water reacts to the heater, and it will literally boil water. In fact, you got to be a little careful because it gets very hot very fast. And the meals are actually quite good. And for people, the people in New Orleans, where you didn't have any water, no electricity, no ice, no grocery stores open, for the last month, those MREs became literally the lifeline for the residents. The other innovation is not so much in the form of anything physical, but in the issue of process. While I was in New Orleans, not only was I working on trying to bring up the communications infrastructure, but I was also working with a faith-based nonprofit charity organization that was providing critical foods, water, ice, hot meals to the residents of New Orleans. But the challenge in New Orleans is getting some of those resources. You cannot get ice, water, diesel fuel up until recently from anywhere other than from the government. And this nonprofit organization was having some real struggles in being able to get into the supply chain to get these resources delivered to them so they could distribute it to the residents. So a couple of us stepped in, did a little MacGyver thinking, and was able to procure a couple of tractor trailer loads of ice and water and other critical supplies to this organization so that they could begin distributing that to the residents. I'm not going to go into the details of how that was done. Everything was above board, but it did require a lot of creativity and convincing and working around the processes in order to get those critical supplies. Some critical basic innovations that I saw that were just clearly lacking. And it was evident that nobody was really sitting down and trying to address what I would really call the critical basic needs following such a large disaster as Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And one was housing. Basically, they evacuated everybody out, put everybody up into hotels. Now they're informing the people in the hotels that they have 2 weeks to find permanent housing. And there's literally nothing left in New Orleans. People's houses are destroyed. And there's no thinking and no creativity being applied to what are the options for housing for these people until their house gets repaired, replaced, whatever. There's just a clear lack of thinking about just things like this basic, like housing, food. Many people, if you read the paper, you're going to have the impression that New Orleans is coming back to life. Today's USA Today had an article talking about, the mass, church mass that was said down in the French Quarters, downtown New Orleans, showing inside. They showed pictures of people sitting in bars, drinking. Believe me, those are all illusions about what's really there. And the fact is that many residents of New Orleans have been off work for over a month, meaning no paycheck. So, if they come back in and they need to locate temporary housing, how do they pay for it? If they want to go to the grocery store and buy food, how do they pay for it? Water. You would not believe the issues or the challenges in securing water. Many parts of New Orleans still do not have water, sewers, or electricity. And then what I would classify really as the fourth critical piece that I think lacked any pre-thought to such a large disaster is communications. Whether that be broadband, cellular voice, landline voice, whatever means of communications you want to use. But I saw a lot of innovations being applied, a lot of creativity in response to the urgent needs that existed to solve the problems on the ground in New Orleans. But what I also saw was clearly any kind of lack of thinking prior to the disaster around housing, food, water, and communications. Now in there, some people would throw sanitation, sewers, toilets, as a fifth area. But we as humans I found and experienced in New Orleans, can be very creative in that space. But what you cannot be creative on is housing, food, water, communications. Those are fundamental basic needs that need to be there. Now, some of the negatives that on the MacGyver is that you're responding to the urgent issues at hand. And now, I wouldn't say that the crisis is over. Believe me, having been in New Orleans, the crisis is far from over. But hindsight is 2020. And one of the things that we need to do, not just here in the U.S., but on a worldwide basis, is to take a look at what happened in New Orleans and learn from it. And again, highlighting the fact that there was lack of any kind of scenario or any kind of pre-thinking around the housing, food, water, communications infrastructure. With just a little bit of pre-effort, I believe that there's a huge, huge payoff. If we thought about what would happen if a city of 3 to 4 million residents had to be completely evacuated, where would you place them? If you had to feed 4 million residents, all within a 300-mile radius of a disaster, how would you feed them? How would you get them food? I mean, the key here is that once you've gone through a little bit of that pre-thinking, you may not have come up with the perfect answer, but when the disaster happens, you can see patterns. You can see patterns that you've already thought about, and they can help you trigger solutions to the problem. Now, what many of you may be asking is okay, that's great. You're trying to tie this into innovation. What is it that you actually experienced in New Orleans, Phil? What is it you actually saw? And let me tell you, I came back from New Orleans changed. It's hard, not to have something like going to New Orleans impact you when you hand out a case of water, a few MREs, and a bag of ice, and an older couple are literally crying and hugging you, thanking you for being there to give them water. One night, this nonprofit organization that I'm involved in was serving meals, free food, basically 3 hot meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Mother, 3 little girls came in for dinner one night. I think this was last Wednesday. The 7-year-old, it was her birthday, but they had lost everything. She'd been out of work, had not received a paycheck. They were living the 4 of them were sleeping on a single mattress on the floor of an apartment. And it was the 7-year-old's birthday. And we all scrambled, searched our bags, searched our briefcases to pull together something that we could use as a birthday present for this 7-year-old girl. Someone had a newspaper. We used the newspaper as wrapping paper. The cook hurriedly tried to use whatever he could to make a little cake. We used matches for candles. It was a scramble to try to pull something together. Someone had Play-Doh in their car from their kids, but try to create some kind of normality for this family. I mean, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. We were in Jefferson Parish. Parish in New Orleans is the equivalent of a county, but we were serving food into St. Bernard Parish, which is one of the hardest hits. On the drive there on the highway, you could literally drive 10, 15 minutes at full highway speed. You would be the only ones on the highway, and as you looked left and right, you didn't see a single house standing. There were ocean-going barges that were inland, meaning not near any water. There were cars on top of houses. There was 9 to 12 inches of silt, dirt. The contamination level was so high that any volunteers coming in had to have shots before they would even let you into the area. It was so contaminated that this particular nonprofit organization that I was involved in couldn't even cook in some of the areas. We had to truck hot food in order to serve. The smell. For any of you who've ever traveled overseas and you've gone into certain countries that that just have, smells that you just, where you have large human population living very, very closely together. Well, those smells are nothing compared to the smells in New Orleans. The base camp where we were set up had 4 to 5 feet of water in it just a week before. You could see the water lines on the front of the buildings. The airport, the New Orleans airport, for those of you who followed the news, was transformed into a hospital. Well, the floor in the New Orleans airport is carpet, and you cannot sanitize carpeting. So they were literally, when I flew out yesterday, they were in the process of ripping out all the carpeting, any upholstery, any porous material, anything inside the New Orleans airport in order to remove it and burn it because of potential contamination from patients that were brought to the airport to be made into a makeshift hospital. In my case, my role there was to bring up communications infrastructure. And through donations of companies such as GSI in New Jersey, who FedExed a 1.5-meter satellite dish to me in New Orleans, and who also secured donation of satellite access, we were able to bring up the first broadband access into New Orleans. We were able to wire up a very large circus tent as a Wi-Fi hotspot, allowing anybody, including relief workers, residents, to come in and be able to get out and get onto the broadband access to access their emails, connect with family members, or to apply for disaster relief support from the government. As I said, earlier, I came back changed. You go to a disaster, something like Hurricane Katrina, and when you think you've got it all figured out from the standpoint of what's important and what's not important, but when you go to Katrina, it really forces you to rebalance the scale. When you see people literally, crushed emotionally when they come back for the first time after being gone for a month. And this last week was the first week they were allowing people back into New Orleans. People coming back in and realizing that there's literally nothing to come back to. You quickly realize what's really important and what's not really important. One of the concerns I have for New Orleans is the fact that it's coming out of the news. There's less and less emphasis on it. And based on what I saw, and I tell you, it is unbelievably devastating, the extent of the damage to New Orleans from both the hurricane and then the subsequent floods. That my best guess is that New Orleans really won't even get restarted for at least 9 months, probably more like a year plus. And even then, I would predict that New Orleans is probably going to be 35, 40, maybe even 45% less population. Many people that I talked to were coming back, saw that they had nothing left, and were moving someplace else. And they will not be going back to New Orleans. New Orleans people still need our help. I don't want to turn this into an ad or a promo or a PSA. But if you have the means and the willingness to help, the people of New Orleans are going to need everybody's help for quite some time. This is not just a quick, the typical hurricane where you go in for 2 to 4 weeks and pull out and everything's back to normal quickly. This is going to be a very, very long-term activity. As I said before, we're going to skip segment 2. We're going to go to segment 3, the killer questions. And actually, with killer questions, we're going to do this in a little bit reverse order, what I call reverse killer questions. And I'm going to tie this again back to what I saw in New Orleans. And the way I want to go through this segment is really to talk about the questions that should have been asked prior to the hurricane. These are questions that should have been asked prior to any natural disaster. This is not an exhaustive list. I've only picked out, 3 or 4 of them. But when I looked at and experienced what was going on in New Orleans, there were just some obvious questions that came to mind. The first question is what assumptions in my service delivery am I making about my customers' abilities? What assumptions in my service delivery am I making about my customers' ability? Well, the perfect example of this is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is the federal government side here in the U.S. government that responds to these natural disasters and that provides relief effort, funds, monies to help people get through the disaster. Well, FEMA was telling people 2 things. One is that you need to sign up for your benefits if you were impacted by it. And the way to do that was to visit their website at FEMA.gov. Well, the problem was nobody had electricity. Nobody had broadband access. There was an assumption made by FEMA and by other agencies, both state and local, that residents would have some means of access in order to communicate and to secure their benefits. And this was not the case. Another question: what service level could I offer if I controlled the entire value chain? What service levels could I offer if I controlled the entire value chain? In the case of Katrina, and many of you saw it in the press, and I can go into all kinds of nitty-gritty details, the fact that the value chain, meaning recovery from the disaster and support for the survivors, there was huge battles between local, state, and federal governments. And the fact that no one group controlled the entire value chain. And believe me, coming out of New Orleans and having been on the ground, I am now a big believer that one organization, one agency needs to be controlling the entire value chain. The handoffs, the politics, the processes between the local, state, and federal are significantly slowing down the recovery efforts in Louisiana and specifically New Orleans. Third question that I think could have been asked prior to Katrina and had a little thought been put into it, could have had a huge impact. And that is, am I designing the core processes to accommodate the exceptions? Am I designing the core processes to accommodate the exceptions? Well, the core processes that the state, local, and federal agencies put in place assumed a certain kind of relief effort being done. And those relief efforts are primarily tied around the disaster. Getting in there, serving food, providing shelter, providing medical care to the victims of the disaster, and then getting out. Well, the problem is that in the case of New Orleans, there's not just a disaster, but there's a recovery. And there's no processes existing to support a 9 to 12 month mission to literally what I call reboot a city. Nobody's ever done it before. How do you reboot a city after an entire city has been evacuated? And then the last question, and this one's kind of a funny one from the standpoint of maybe it's not one that you could have thought of ahead of time, but it just struck me when I saw some of the MacGyver inventions that were being created. And this one is, what regularly used makeshifts can I capture in a product design? What regularly used makeshifts can I capture in a product design? Well, one of the number one challenges in New Orleans, believe it or not, are showers and toilets. And showers in particular. After you've been working in the contaminated space, serving food or helping people, recover valuables from their homes, you literally get covered with this contaminated dirt. So showers become critical. One of the gentlemen in the base camp where I was based out of basically took a bunch of pallets, wooden pallets that were coming in off of the tractor trailers loaded with food and water, and took a number of these and created what I would call a pallet pool. Took a bunch of trash bag liners, taped them together, and literally created a little square pool that he could lay down in, one, to cool off because it was so hot, but two, also to be able to get this dust and dirt and grime. Eventually, FEMA did deliver what we called FEMA shower trailers. These were trailers that literally had 8 to 12 shower stalls built into them. And believe me, when they showed up, there were cheers amongst the volunteers in order to be able to have a means to get a regular shower to clean off the dust and dirt off of you after working in the 110, 115 degree Fahrenheit heat index that was going on in New Orleans last week. So what regularly used makeshifts can I capture in a product design? Well, with that, we're going to wrap up. Thanks for listening. Sorry for the rambling on this podcast. I guess the last couple have been this way. But just coming in off of New Orleans, it is, coming up on 2 o'clock in the morning East Coast time. I am in California, though, but my clock is a little out of whack. So again, thanks for putting up with this. Thanks for all the new listeners. This is not a typical podcast. They are typically much more thought out, but this has been kind of a very unique experience of going to New Orleans and spending the week there, providing whatever help we could, and bringing up some of the first broadband available now in New Orleans for the residents to use. So again, thanks for listening. Please keep the feedback coming. Drop me an email, podcast@killerinnovations.com. Call the feedback line at 703-636-4460, or you can always Skype me at Phil_McKinney. Keep in mind, we're at the start of a new month, so all of your votes have been cleared out on Podcast Alley, and your votes start over again. So if you voted last month, you can vote again, or if you've never voted, this could be your first time of voting. Why do I ask for votes, or why do I suggest that you do vote? Well, voting on Podcast Alley is the easiest way for you to say thanks to the producers of your favorite podcasts, whether it's this podcast or any of the other podcasts you listen to. Typically, there's a lot of hours invested to pull podcast material together, to do the research, the production, and cost associated to hosting the MP3 files and buying the bandwidth that enables you to download it. So going over to vote is just it's your easiest way to tell the producers of the podcast that you truly do appreciate that effort. So thanks for listening. If you're not subscribed, get subscribed. Get others to subscribe. And we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.